evening, everyone, and welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. We're continuing to talk in a sort of larger sense about how to do word studies in our looking at the Bible and in how to tell what's a good word study and what's a bad word study. Obviously, languages and translations sometimes just swap one for one, but sometimes you're not just translating words, you're also translating culture. And we have many modern examples of how this works, and sometimes words just don't quite have a one-for-one swap from one language to another. It's especially more difficult when it comes to something like the Bible, written mostly in either ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek with a bit of Aramaic in there as well, because you're not just translating kind of culture and language, but also centuries of history. And so some of it can just be a one-for-one kind of swap, but some of it takes a bit more digging and a bit more insight into the history and culture of the time. And so some word studies can be really, really helpful. And so what I've said the whole time is what we need to be careful of is trying to make word studies and studying these ancient languages into something like turning the Bible into some kind of secret code or cipher, as if everything that is meaning in the Bible is somehow hidden and you have to go looking for it. Most English translations and most translations from the biblical text into other languages are going to be pretty good. You're not going to really have trouble understanding a lot of it, although we always need more knowledge and more understanding of the history and culture. But the Bible in its original languages is not some hidden code or cipher. It's just ancient languages. So we just need to take care in our translating and understand that when we're reading it, we're reading a translation. So last week, within that sort of macro sense and a more of a micro sense, we started talking about the ways in which the ways in which we study the history and culture of things like language can really shift our theological understanding and then therefore shift kind of practically how we see ourselves as Christians. So we started talking about what is sometimes termed the new perspective on how we understand someone like the Apostle Paul. And within the new perspective, it's it's not a singular movement, but there are a number of Bible scholars who are kind of loosely grouped together because they're all coming from a similar sort of angle, but not necessarily coming to the same conclusions. But the angle they're basically coming from is rather than reading most of Paul's work, especially something like Romans, through the lens of Reformation church history, let's really try and go back and study the language and culture to try and understand Paul on his own terms. And we talked a bit about how a lot of our understanding of salvation, a lot of our understanding of Paul's argument in Romans is almost in a sense based on Luther's own sort of putting back on Paul his experience with the Catholic Church. So Luther saw the Catholic Church as an institution that was putting up barriers in between people and God and making people earn their salvation. And in some ways, his interpretation of Paul begins to sort of reflect that in how he constructs his view of the Pharisees as basically ancient counterparts to the Catholic Church of his day, and the indulgences to the laws and the Torah of the time. And in some ways that sort of it makes sense and it clicks in a kind of easy way, which is why it's had some staying power. But part of this new perspective is showing that that's not necessarily a very faithful historical rendering of Paul's situation or what Paul is maybe trying to argue, and to try and construct Paul as arguing against a sort of legalistic faith that earns your salvation is kind of anachronistic. That is, it puts our sort of modern ideas back onto an ancient text. And if you were to go to talk to Paul or someone else from his day and talk in those terms, they might not know at all what you're talking about because that's the way we're understanding it, but not the way he was understanding it. And so there's a couple things that go into that I want to get into today, moving on from that. And they're very linked into each other. So the first is a distinction between an old understanding how am I getting into this? Last week we talked about how in an old way of understanding, you really have to kind of do some mental gymnastics, because on the one hand, you're trying to read along with Luther and the reformers, you're trying to read Paul as saying, it is grace through faith, not works. Nothing you do will save you. But at the same time, you then have to argue, but what about people who do nothing, or never live out their faith, or are even bad people their whole lives, and then somehow come to faith or have a conversion experience on their deathbed, and by no works of their own, but only by the grace of Jesus, they're let in to heaven. And again, that's this whole kind of construct. And you kind of have to do some mental gymnastics with that. You also then have to do some mental gymnastics with verses like James chapter 2 about how faith without deeds is dead. And so to say, well, if we are saved only by faith and no works, nothing you do helps save you, then why do we have to do works? Surely that's part of a works-based righteousness. And then you're having to do a lot of mental gymnastics to try and figure out this fine line between saying you don't have to do anything to earn salvation, but at the same time you should do things. You see what I'm saying? So you end up sort of arguing back with yourself by saying you don't do anything to earn salvation, but at the same time you need to do things. But you're not earning your salvation, but you need to do things, but don't. And do you see how that whole construct begins to be difficult? And so where we can sort of unpick this is not by saying, yes, you do have to do things to earn salvation, but by re-entering the historical context, we see how some of these words and some of these concepts have become kind of shifted over time, and especially words like grace and faith. And those are the two words we're going to talk about a bit more today. So we've got grace and we've got faith, right? So the old way is you are saved by grace through faith. And the way in especially a Reformed tradition, like we are in the Church of Scotland, will understand that is that grace is the free forgiveness of God that you do nothing to earn. And faith is, at least in large part, a sort of cognitive recognition of that grace's existence, essentially. So basically, in your mind, agreeing with the idea that Jesus died, and saying the Apostles' Creed, or in some traditions, maybe something like the Sinner's Prayer, or something like that. And a lot of it is cognitive. But then out of that cognitive faith comes a lifestyle. That's kind of the Reformed way to see it. It's grace through faith. And so our faith is active in some ways, but it's mostly a sort of cognitive recognition of the existence of this grace. Where something like the New Perspective or a New Understanding comes along is to say, the word for grace and this idea of grace has sort of shifted in meaning over time. And for Paul, what he's talking about is not necessarily what we're talking about. Paul's using this word grace, but it's loaded with meaning that exists before Christianity. It's a word that exists in the culture. And so he's not reinventing it or using it in a way that would be unfamiliar to his hearers, in a way that would be understood more by Martin Luther than it would be by the Jews or first century Greeks that he's writing to. And so when we dig back into the culture, what we see as this interplay between grace and faith is a bit different, and it has an interplay outside of a theological context. So grace and faith might work like this. You have a very wealthy person who is in some ways kind of the patron of a town or a city, and they pay for a lot of things. They've maybe funded a amphitheater, or they've funded arts projects, or they've funded a library, or they've funded just buildings, works, aqueducts, anything like that. They've funded, and they take care of this city. But they don't necessarily live there all the time, but they are kind of the patron of the city. This is a system that existed for centuries, and it existed even in some ways in different sort of twists in even in the British Isles at different times with a sort of wealthy landowner who looks after people. So you have the patron of the city, and the patron is just offering this grace. And the word is charis, and this charis might actually be better translated as maybe even like favor. And the city does nothing to earn it. This patron just takes care of the city by their own, maybe we might say good graces, but they just take care of them. The city can do nothing to get this money from this patron. They offer it freely. But at the same time, the patron is also expecting a bit of reciprocity. So obviously they can't pay him back, but what they offer him is allegiance. They offer him things like when he comes to town, if he was to come and visit the city, they would go out and meet him. They would throw a party. They would host, and they would again sing this person's praises. They would worship them, offer them everything they had in return, and would offer what was called, what we've translated as faith or pistis. And so you have this interplay of grace and faith, charis and pistis. And in this ancient context, it is again a patron freely giving favor to a town or a city or people. And what they offer that patron in return is faithfulness. And maybe in some ways, faithfulness is even a better way to translate that, because faith, again, as an English word, has shifted. And it's shifted from the idea of faithfulness, like we talk about even in a marriage, a partner being faithful to the other partner, into faith as a sort of cognitive idea, kind of going hand in hand with belief, of agreeing with certain faith statements. We believe and we have faith that Jesus was who he said he was. We have faith that the Bible is inspired and useful and all of these sorts of things. And the way that those two words have shifted, grace and faith, has shifted us along the way to a sort of Reformation style understanding of a free gift of forgiveness that then we have faith in, but then we live out, and then we sort of enter into that system I was describing earlier. But looking at this other way, where it's favor and faithfulness, and it's sort of in the context of kind of a patron, you can see how this also works. And for maybe someone like Paul and his hearers, that sort of system makes sense, where God as a patron is offering us favor. It's nothing we earn. It's nothing we can do to just grasp hold of. It's offered to us freely. But at the same time, as receivers of that favor, we offer God in return our faithfulness. Our faithfulness does not earn that favor. It doesn't make the patron love you anymore. We've done nothing to earn the favor. But at the same time, we owe that reciprocity. We owe that faithfulness. And so do you see how that kind of historical understanding breaks us out of this weird sort of philosophical conundrum of not a works-based righteousness, but you still have to do works and all of this sort of stuff. And you get kind of tied in knots over this idea of you don't do anything to earn your faith. No, you don't do anything to earn. But what about someone who does nothing? Then like, and you're kind of stuck in a quandary that you don't need to be stuck in. And so this idea of grace and faith, as we understand it, can break us out of that. So that's one way in particular that we can see how studying the ancient language and the ancient culture isn't about necessarily finding hidden meanings or cipher, but it's about opening up. What would Paul be intending? It's again this phrase I've used before when we've talked about interpretation, what we call author's intended meaning. Sometimes you might see that referred to as the aim, the AIM, the author's intended meaning. And this is just trying to get back to, without the baggage of centuries of history, what would this person have maybe been thinking in their mind when they wrote this down to the people that were of their own culture and of that day. If I was to write a letter to someone now, and someone 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 300 years from now was to read it, they would be reading it in light of their own history, their own experiences. And there's a chance that they would misinterpret what I'm saying. They might misunderstand words that have shifted in meaning over time. They might misunderstand concepts. We're never going to be able to do this perfectly. I want to make that clear. We're never going to be able to perfectly understand what Paul would have meant, or what Peter would have meant, or what the gospel writers would have meant. But we can do a better job of understanding that and try and get away from some of these anachronisms, this way of understanding the text only in light of our own history and our own experiences, because we tend to import meaning, and we can make some kind of mistakes that aren't just about, they're not just about crossing T's and dotting I's. Sometimes these have real implications. So something like this grace and faith kind of understanding can have real implications for how we live out our lives, how we care for other people, and how we live as Christians. There's real impact to how we understand this. And so I think it's important to look at some of this. Because of time, we're going to leave the next one for another time. And we will get to next week, we'll look at another sort of translation that's the same sort of thing, and it actually has to do with that word faith or faithfulness. So we'll get into that a bit more next week, and hopefully this will keep making sense as we kind of build on this argument as we go. So hopefully this is, as my grandmother used to say, clear as mud, and it's maybe helpful in understanding why we are studying the ancient languages and ancient history of the Bible. It's not, again, to try and get at some kind of secret meaning or knowledge that's somehow hidden from you, the average person. But it's just about doing research, understanding things like we would any other subject, any other topic, just trying to understand it better, trying to get back more into a way of reading the Bible that can be most helpful to us. Because it does have real impact for us. It's not just theoretical. There's real stuff in this, and I hope, at least for you, it's interesting. For me, it's really interesting as well. So thanks for watching this evening, and catch us again next time as we continue to kind of dive into this material. Thanks for watching. Have a good week.